Okay. Hi, good morning, everybody. It's 9:05, so we'll kick off the program, our program today. Good morning and welcome to Strat-Based ADR Institute's virtual town hall discussion on impactful governance reforms for the next administration. My name is Paco Pangalangan. I'm the Executive Director of Strat-Based ADR Institute, and I'll be serving as your host/moderator for today's discussion. This event has assembled a range of thought leaders who will share their ideas on the Philippine governance and which reforms the country must prioritize moving forward. Our speakers today include authors of the Strat-Based ADR Institute's special study series entitled Beyond the Crisis, a Strategic Agenda for the Next President, which discusses policy recommendations for the next administration. The research and recommendations for this next administration will be part of what they will be discussing this morning. To officially, now that I've said that, to officially kick off our event for today, please allow me to introduce the president of Strat-Based ADR Institute, Professor Dido Manhit, for his opening remarks. Professor Manhit, good morning.
Good morning, Paco. Good morning to our participants. We expect a lot of participation from governance advocates this morning. I welcome you to our webinar, our virtual town hall discussion called Impactful Governance Reforms for the Next Administration. Proud of the work that's been done by our partner scholars, governance advocates that we'll be hearing this morning. You know, in the Institute, at the start of the pandemic, we identified what we call pandemic challenges that cuts across issues of social, economic, political, and even security challenges in the country since March 2020. But at the core of all this is governance. And early this year, January, in my regular commentary with the Philippine Daily Inquirer, I raised this issue that the elections provide for us an opportunity to set the course of what the future is for the country. But again, at the core of that is the need for a forward-looking governance outlook, whoever that administration is. I would argue that it should be three-pronged, anchored on the collaboration of government, private sector, civil society, and one that is people-centered, sustainable, and globally competitive. And these views of mine, I try to reflect what we have tracked quarter after quarter in terms of most urgent concerns of Filipinos. True, we continue to deal with COVID, but right now, when you look at the most urgent concerns of Filipinos, it's economic in nature. It seems that this long health crisis has created what we call an economic challenge or economic consequences. Presyo ng bilihin, trabaho at kita, and hirapan at tuto. But consistent to what we have seen since 2020 is we need to fight graft and corruption. There is this desire for accountability, for transparency, and more responsive governance in our country. And it reminds me of a data that we commissioned with Pulse Asia, whereby last December we asked, what are the issues that candidates for national position should focus on? And again, consistent are economic issues. But in between it is a governance question. With all the drama, the noise of this outgoing Duterte administration, it seems that graft and corruption continues to be a challenge for the Filipino nation, for the Filipino people. And what we need is an effective change through reforms that, despite the economic nature of these concerns of the Filipino people, there's a need to shift the attention towards the governance and structural issues contributing to the prevalent and worsening impact of this national concern. And it had to do with institutional governance reforms. One that must be future-oriented, and I would even add strategic, but also needs and value-based in terms of prioritizing accessibility and delivery of services to the general public, aiming at improvement of the quality of life of the Filipino people. And how do we make ourselves competitive globally to bring in investment that will create jobs, that will address all these economic concerns of the Philippine people. We can take note of the policy agenda of the top 3 presidential candidates. But of course, publicly I've said it's now down to 2 candidates. What is a bongbong governance Marcos agenda or Marcos Jr. agenda? What about a VP Lenny Robredo governance agenda? So we need to raise these issues. We need to look at this crisis beyond this crisis and really challenge the next administration. What is your governance agenda? In my February commentary at the eve of the start of the campaign, I spoke of the need to fight corruption, that we need to demand transparency, accountability, and integrity in government, that we should consider the character and capacity of those wooing our votes, looking at them, analyzing where they stand. Can they really be institution builders, have the right understanding and vision for the Filipino nation, for the Filipino people? And my last word, everyone must fight corruption. And we need the whole of society to fight for that. And we're happy to have and share this morning the 4 papers, special studies, strategic papers that will be presented by our colleagues and partners in fighting and ensuring that we should fight corruption and ensure a stronger governance initiative and advocacy for the next administration. Again, good morning and welcome to our virtual town hall discussion today that focuses on impactful governance reforms.
Thank you, Professor Manhid, for setting the stage for today's discussion. Thank you also for really connecting the discussion today and highlighting how relevant it is, a discussion because of the upcoming elections and how important fighting corruption and demanding for transparency and accountability from the next administration will be as part of our governance agenda for post-COVID-19 or beyond the crisis, as we say. So thank you again, Professor Manhid.
Thank you.
At this point, right, and before I introduce our first panelist for this morning's event, I wanted to thank first of all our 74 participants here on Zoom and the more participants that we have on Facebook for attending this morning's discussion. We have a Q&A function actually for Zoom and the comment section for our Facebook participants, where you can ask your questions, type them out. We have a team that's collecting them and perhaps grouping them together by theme, and we'll try to get to them later during the Q&A or the open forum at around 10:15. So please keep those questions coming, and we'll try to get to them as best we can later on in the program. With that said, now with the house rules aside, putting the house rules aside, I am pleased rather to introduce our first panelist for this morning's event. Our first panelist is a trustee and program convener of Strat-Based ADRi Institute and is a professor of political science at the De La Salle University. Dr. Francisco Rico Magno will be joining us this morning and will be discussing recommendations from his paper entitled Governance Agenda for Development. Dr. Magno, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paco. I would like to thank Professor Lindo Manhid for including me in this panel. So let me share the highlights of recent study I did for strat-based ADRi on governance for development. This presentation would show how the Philippines fared in terms of the quality of governance through the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI, over the past 6 years. WGI is used in the Philippine Development Plan. So it is widely used to monitor government performance around the world. And it is very important to assess and examine the results of WGI over several years, because it provides us with guideposts for improvements. It will identify collective action mechanisms that promote improvements in controlling corruption, voice and accountability, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and political stability. WGI have been measuring the quality of governance in more than 200 countries since 1996. It contains 6 composite indicators of governance, including voice and accountability, political stability and absence of violence/terrorism, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. These indicators are based on variables collected from 31 data sources that cover governance perceptions that come from survey respondents, non-government organizations, commercial business information providers, and public sector organizations across the world. The governance score of a country under WGI can range from -2.5, which is considered weak governance performance, to 2.5, which is considered strong governance performance. Table 1, which I will show in the next slide, would show the quality of Philippine governance from 2015 to 2020. The Philippines received positive scores in voice and accountability from 2015 to 2019. However, the estimated scores started to decline from 2017 onwards. On the other hand, the country got negative scores in control of corruption, rule of law, and political stability throughout the entire period. It got shifting scores in both regulatory quality and government effectiveness. So this is a summary of the performance of the Philippines in the various indicators. So as I mentioned, there is a dip in voice and accountability, and slight improvements in regulatory quality, as well as in government effectiveness, because there was a decline in several years after 2015. So look at the score on control of corruption. So it remains negative, and rule of law has really declined and is negative. And political stability and absence of violence and terrorism is also negative. So this provides us with a graph of how the Philippines is performing in these world governance indicators. You see how over the years it has performed in the basis of these indicators. So let us go first to regulatory quality. Regulatory quality is about capturing perceptions of the ability of the government to formulate and implement sound policies and regulations that permit and promote private sector development. So what I did was to put the Philippines in the context of its neighboring ASEAN countries. So you can see the Philippines in the middle of the pack. Of course, Singapore is at the top of the list in terms of the percentile rank, the ranking of countries in the WGI. So as you can see, Philippines is a percentile rank of 53 by 2020. As presented in that table, the percentile rank of the Philippines place it in 5th spot amongst ASEAN members from 2015 to 2019. Even if it's listed in the lower half of the latest ASEAN ranking, it should be noted that the country has made certain improvements in the regulatory quality over the past years. This can be attributed to reforms in cutting red tape in the bureaucracy and streamlining business registration in local government units. We take note that in 2019 or 2018, the Ease of Doing Business and Efficient Government Service Delivery Act was passed as an amendment to the Anti-Red Tape Act of 2007. It directs all government offices and agencies, including LGUs, GOCCs, and other government instrumentalities to simplify procedures and expedite transactions in government. Next, we have government effectiveness, which is capturing perceptions of the quality of public services, the quality of the civil service, and the degree of its independence from political pressures, the quality of policy formulation and implementation, and the credibility of the government's commitment to such policies. So you can see where the Philippines is located in this list of ASEAN countries. So it is at the lower rung of the 10 ASEAN countries. So let's explain this table that show that Singapore consistently got the top rank at 100 percentile from 2015 to 2020. The Philippines performed better than Vietnam in 2018 and 2019, but dropped back to 7th spot among ASEAN countries in 2020. The aim to improve the quality of public services would hinge in a large way on the success of efforts at enabling the interoperability of government processes. The Interagency Business Process Interoperability Program was established to facilitate the convergence of government databases. Service delivery model can range from a simple co-location of agencies or one-stop shops to an integrated single window and single door approach. Now we move to voice and accountability, which is capturing perceptions of the extent to which a country's citizens are able to participate in selecting their government, as well as freedom of expression, freedom of association, and a free media. So among the indicators, this is the indicator where the Philippines is performing the best. Although it is second to Indonesia among ASEAN countries. But you see a decline from 2015, and it has really gone down in 2020. This table, the table that I showed you, manifests that the Philippines placed next to Indonesia in the list of ASEAN countries in voice and accountability from 2015 to 2020. Let me cite a governance initiative that survived the transition from the Aquino administration to the Duterte administration. And this initiative promotes voice and accountability, and it is the Philippine Open Government Partnership. The Philippines is one of the 8 founding countries of the OGP in 2011. OGP is a global coalition of reformers within and outside of government that work towards co-creating shared commitments which aim to contribute to improving public service delivery through the mainstreaming of initiatives on access to information, civic participation, public accountability, and leveraging technology to strengthen governance. The next indicator is control of corruption, which is capturing perceptions of the extent to which public power is exercised for private gain, including both petty and grand forms of corruption, as well as capture of the state by elites and private interests. So we see here the Philippines is at the bottom half of this 10 Asian country list. So it's closer to the poorer countries in the ASEAN. So this is how we are located in the context of controlling corruption in ASEAN, among ASEAN countries. During pandemic times, the risk areas include the withholding of accurate health data, irregularities in public procurement, purchase of substandard equipment, and misappropriation of health budgets. This statement actually came from a global report citing the pandemic risks the corruption risk from the pandemic situation. And it is reflected in what happened in the case of our country, where we saw how Congress probed the use of PhilHealth funds and the procurement of overpriced medical supplies from Pharmaly. Charges were also filed against local officials for anomalies in the distribution of emergency cash assistance. Next is the rule of law, which is capturing perceptions of the extent to which agents have confidence in and abide by the rules of society, and in particular, the quality of contract enforcement, property rights, the police and the courts, as well as the likelihood of crime and violence. So again, what you see here is the Philippines being located at the bottom half of the list of ASEAN countries. But what you can see here clearly is a decline in the percentile rank of the Philippines for the past several years. And we have this current percentile rank, 31.73 as of 2020. The table I showed you manifests that the Philippines is ranked 7th out of 10 ASEAN countries in the observance of the rule of law. Its percentile rank in this category has been on a downward spiral since 2016. To address, these are some of the initiatives to address rule of law challenges. To address court congestion and improve citizens' access to swift and fair justice, the Supreme Court of the Philippines initiated several reforms. This includes the continuous trial of criminal cases, that initiated changes in court operations, such as in the calendaring of cases. It reduced criminal case duration by 55 to 61 days. There's also the electronic case management system or e-court reform, introduced to the courts an automated electronic case management system that allows judges, clerks of court, and the public to monitor cases in real time. And finally, the political stability and absence of violence, terrorism, which capture perceptions of the likelihood of political instability and or politically motivated violence, including terrorism. So in the ASEAN ranking, we are just ahead of Myanmar in political stability. As presented in that table, the Philippines placed 9th among ASEAN members in political stability. It ranked ahead of Myanmar, where the civilian government was overthrown through a military coup in February 2021. The Bangsamoro Organic Law was signed into law on July 26, 2018. It abolished arms and provided for the basic structure of government for a new Bangsamoro region for Muslim Mindanao. This followed the peace agreement signed between the government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in 2014. Now, let me go to the recommendations based on a quick review of how the Philippines is faring in WGI. Democratic backsliding and weak governance contributed to the country's poor pandemic performance. The declining percentile rank of the Philippines in the WGI over the past several years can be arrested through improvements in controlling corruption, voice and accountability, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and political stability. In terms of controlling corruption, we have to take note that doing so requires a comprehensive approach. Corruption should not be simplified as the work of individuals who went astray, because there is a tendency to look at strong leaders who will carry the fight against corruption. Corruption is not just a matter of having corrupt individuals. We have to consider the presence of corrupt systems. Corruption prevention strategies should look for ways to reduce monopoly power, limit and clarify discretion, and promote transparency and accountability in governance. As a crime of calculation, corruption could be countered by converting it into a high-risk activity through the judicious application of institutional controls, checks and balances, social accountability, and the rule of law. The Office of the Ombudsman is mandated by law to investigate and prosecute on its own or on complaint by any person, any act or omission of any public officer or employee, office or agency when such act or omission appears to be illegal, unjust, improper, or inefficient. There is a need for the institutional strengthening of the Office of the Ombudsman by upgrading employee skills, augmenting compensation and benefits, and enhancing its fiscal autonomy. The agency is hampered by the lack of lawyers and other resources given its workload. Under the law, the Civil Service Commission administers and enforces the merit system for all levels and ranks in the civil service. It promulgates policies, standards, and guidelines for the civil service and adopts plans and programs to promote the economical, efficient, and effective personnel administration in the government. The Career Executive Service Board manages leadership and integrity development training for career officials in the bureaucracy. However, political appointees are not subjected to this rigorous capacity building program. There is a need to appoint more career personnel in the higher ranks of the bureaucracy. In fact, in the Philippine Development Plan, I think that was the PDP prior to the current one, the appointments made in the Philippines was compared with political appointments in South Korea. So based on this comparison, it showed that in the case of the Philippines, political appointments are made very deeply in the bureaucracy, unlike South Korea, where political appointments are just down to the level of undersecretary or deputy minister in their government. Let us now go to recommendations on government effectiveness. Government effectiveness can be enhanced with the passage of an e-government act that would enable interoperability of government data and processes to foster efficiency in the delivery of services. This would aid in the pursuit of a whole-of-government approach to manage the interdependencies across areas of government and among levels of implementation in national government agencies and LGUs. So this can complement the passage of or the creation of the Department of Information and Communications Technology. But there has to be stronger support for the mandate of the ICT and really encouraging and requiring all government agencies to really pursue digital transformation models and programs. Policy integration promotes interoperability, remove silos, streamline processes, and address functional overlaps. The passage of the Public Service Act is expected to respond to the demands of the digital age and augment incomes in a post-pandemic era. The country can attract new investments from foreign companies in telecommunications, transportation, and other service sectors. So it's very important to monitor the implementation of this very important law. There's also a need to address governance gaps, including the lack of LGU commitment and capacity, short-term vision in planning and budgeting, unprepared and disempowered citizens, and inadequate policy environment. Vertical and horizontal linkages across different levels of government in development planning, investment programming, and budgeting should be strengthened in areas of convergence identified. The barriers and distortions in intergovernmental relations should be addressed, including unclear roles of different government levels, fragmented relations, and poor fiscal responsibilities of LGUs. With the passage of the forthcoming implementation of the Mandanas ruling, where LGUs would be receiving a greater share of internal revenue allotment, the push for greater vertical integration between national government, and local government units would be expected. So it's very important to monitor this devolution, what is called as the devolution transition plans. Right-sizing the national government would be a key policy measure to improve public service delivery. The program will require agencies to rationalize their staffing pattern with their mandate and functions, and in consideration of other agencies' mandate and functions to eliminate duplication. It will also address the growing number of contractual personnel in government. Yung napakarami nating mga job, what is called JOs or job orders. The passage of the Civil Service Code would address deeply rooted problems besetting the public service, such as corruption, red tape, violations of employee rights, and weak organizational effectiveness. In terms of voice participation and accountability, it would be improved through the passage of a Freedom of Information Act that would require government agencies to allow public review and copy of all government information to promote meaningful and increased participation of the people in government decision-making and public accountability. A Budget Reform Act would incorporate the ingredients of a modern, transparent, and participatory budget system. The institutionalization of citizens' participation in the budget process would also promote shared accountability. Part of this effort to engage in participatory reform would be the passage of a Political Party Development Act that would strengthen the political party system and build democratic institutions. On the other hand, the Campaign Finance Reform Act would regulate campaign contributions and promote transparency in resources or in sources of funds and campaign expenditures. To strengthen the rule of law, the passage of a charter for the Commission on Human Rights would provide an effective and expanded structural and functional organization to protect the human rights of Filipino citizens at home and abroad. So actually this line is actually a recommendation on the improvement of the rule of law. Okay, so that is what I just said as a rule of law recommendation. I'm down to my last two slides. To further support my recommendation for streamlining LGU public expenditure management, I argued that the government's agenda in the post-COVID-19 era should be anchored on the Sustainable Development Goals to support the attainment of citizen aspirations. Actually, SDGs are integrated in the Philippine Development Plan. So what is just needed in pursuit of a whole of government approach is for local government units to align their comprehensive development programs, or CDP, or comprehensive development plan, with the PDP and the SDGs. SDG localization should be pursued in the context of the need to mobilize research capacity, analyze data, harness technology, and build knowledge partnerships to generate solutions to real-world problems. The fourth industrial revolution is a concept widely discussed in various platforms such as the World Economic Forum. It has been emphasized that the fourth industrial revolution will shape the future of education and work, as well as the provision of public services and the realization of development goals. Amid the fourth industrial revolution, cities, provinces, municipalities, and barangays need to become smarter, sustainable, and responsive to the needs of citizens. Smart cities are the result of knowledge-intensive and creative strategies aiming at enhancing the socio-economic, ecological, logistic, and competitive performance of cities. The localization of SDGs and its attainment would involve the creation of smart, inclusive, and resilient cities that rely on open data and governance innovations that address citizen demand for better public services. On that note, let me end my presentation. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and good day to everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Magno. I really appreciated that talk. Most especially how you use these international studies, these international rankings. as guideposts for your recommendations for the governance agenda for development of the next administration. Indeed, there are a broad set of reforms that are needed clearly, and thank you for so comprehensively covering them. I know that you do have to jump to a different event, so I really appreciate the comprehensive discussion that we've already had, given the short time that we have with you. So thank you again, Dr. Magno, and perhaps there is that hope that you'll be around or be able to return in time for the question and answer portion later on. But if not, thank you very much, sir, for your presentation today. So next up, so Dr. Magno was talking about the governance agenda, and of course, part of any discussion about governance and transparency and accountability is public spending. So the next speaker that we have with us this morning is Zaiza Suzara, who's the Executive Director of the Institute for Leadership, Empowerment, and Democracy, which is a nonprofit, non-stock think tank based in the Ateneo, if I'm not mistaken, or I lead. Ms. Zaiza will be talking about the paper that they wrote for the Institute called Rethinking Public Spending Priorities Towards an Inclusive Recovery. Zaiza, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Paco. Thank you again to StratBase for inviting IRI to present the paper, which we actually wrote as a special study for StratBase's governance agenda. I have around 30 slides. I will try to compress that to a 15-minute presentation. But as you know, that's how it is when we talk about the national budget. So yes, the title of the paper is Rethinking Public Spending Priorities Towards an Inclusive Recovery. And I'm really glad Dr. Magno sort of gave a very good discussion about governance and how that relates to public budgeting. And it really segs into my presentation, and there are a lot of overlaps there. So this morning, I'll just briefly go through my outline, just an introduction about public budgeting, and then some key observations on the 2022 national budget. When we wrote this paper, we specifically focused on COVID-19 funds and the executive proposed version of the 2022 national budget, which is formally known as the National Expenditure Program. At that point in time, there was no enacted version of the budget yet, but for purposes of updating the data and the research, I thought of including some updates, some highlights from the enacted version, and then I'll immediately go to conclusion and recommendations. So just to start off this whole discussion, the public budget is really at the core of governance. In principle, it's the clearest expression of any government's development agenda. And we can think of it as the financial blueprint of economic development. And Professor Dindo Manhit already mentioned in his introduction that a lot of the problems that we faced are economic and socio-economic in nature. But Barack Obama brought it a bit further, and he said that a budget is more than just a series of numbers on a page. It's actually an embodiment of our values. So as I go through my presentation of the budget, maybe you can think about what values are embodied in it under the current Duterte regime. In times of crisis, the national budget is actually the most potent tool in the government's fiscal arsenal. This year, we have two valid national budgets. That's the 2021 General Appropriations Act, which amounts to 4.5 trillion pesos. And we also have the 2022 General Appropriations Act, which amounts to 5.1 trillion pesos. The 2021 General Appropriations Act is still valid this year because Congress extended its validity due to a lot of unspent funds on the part of many government agencies. So just a recap of the COVID-19 funds. So as of June 30, 2021, based on the DBM's report, they said that a total of 608 billion pesos was released under Bayanihan 1 and Bayanihan 2. And you can see there the breakdown as to how much was released, how much was actually obligated and disbursed, and how much was unspent by the agencies. Although 600 billion pesos looks like a huge number, the truth is the Philippines suffered the worst economic slump in Southeast Asia, but it launched the smallest fiscal packages in the region. So just to note, Singapore had about 18% of its GDP, Malaysia 4.9%, Indonesia 3.8%, Vietnam 3.6%. The Philippines only spent 3.1% of its GDP for the pandemic response and fiscal stimulus already combined. And also wanted to note that last year, Congress and the executive branch failed to pass a third bayanihan, which was supposed to be a massive stimulus package after the two bayanihan laws have already expired. Last year, we saw, and in 2020, we saw a botched pandemic response, and Dr. Magno already discussed the mismanaged funds and questionable spending, chronic underspending, which plagued key frontline agencies. And the figures I cited here are from the various COA reports, which were the subject of scrutiny in many Senate hearings, Senate Blue Ribbon Committee hearings last year. So also that includes lack of transparency in spending the Bayanihan 1 and Bayanihan 2 funds. As Congress was scrutinizing the funds about Pharmally, they were also beginning to look at the 2022 National Expenditure Program, or the executive proposed version of the national budget. And we looked at basically how the budget priorities were structured, where the funds went, what were the broad priorities of government. And we had 4 key observations. The first is that despite the pandemic, infrastructure continues to dominate the fiscal space. But what many other economists are saying is that build might not be the most effective strategy for health and economic recovery, considering the many economic and socio-economic problems that the country faced since the start of the pandemic. And many global observers, including the IMF and the World Bank, even the ADB, said that the pandemic will leave deep economic scars in our country. And so last year, we pointed out as well, while looking at the budget, that there was a need to address the public health crisis first. But unfortunately, at that point in time, the proposed national budget didn't adequately support a more robust pandemic response. Furthermore, observation 3, we found out that despite record high economic misery, the proposed budget was still not designed for the welfare of ordinary Filipinos and the survival of small businesses. Furthermore, there were expenditure items that do not directly respond to the pandemic, but it still continued to eat up the already limited fiscal space, on top of the huge allocation for infrastructure development. So with respect to infrastructure, in the proposed version of the 2022 national budget, there was about 1.18 trillion pesos worth of infrastructure funds. Broadly, they were allocated in the budgets of DPWH and DOTR. So in the notes here, you see that compared to the 2021 version, the 2022 proposed version of the DPWH budget was 1.38% higher, and then the DOTR budget was 72% higher than its previous year's budget. But there is a problem with the Build program. The ambitious targets that were outlined were actually always adjusted year to year, with drastic reductions occurring as early as 2019, even before the pandemic. Of course, the official line is that Build only began to slow down because of the pandemic. But when we looked at the spending reports published by the DBM for the DPWH and the DOTR, we found out that there's been a slowdown in spending as early as 2017, 2018. And ultimately, those disbursement or spending figures, which are counted in the GDP, show that actual infra spending were much lower than the adjusted targets that were set by the economic managers themselves. Furthermore, the infrastructure program included a rebranded port. This is despite the implementation of the Mandanas ruling. So you would expect that because local infrastructure programs were already part of what's devolved to the local government units, somehow the allocation for local infrastructure projects or port-like patronage driven types of project would decrease. But in the proposed version, there was 123.7 billion pesos allocated for that under the budget of the DPWH. In contrast, the public health response didn't appear to be a priority. So there was 45.7 billion pesos for vaccines, but that was part in the unprogrammed appropriations, meaning it will be funds that are part under the unprogrammed appropriations can only be financed, therefore can only be released by the DBM if there are, number one, excess revenue collections, number two, new revenue collections, or foreign assisted programs. So they said that the financing for the vaccines will be coming from loans, and that is despite the fact that the government has 3.2 trillion pesos of total projected revenues. When we looked at the proposed version of the budget as well, we saw that there was no budget for contact tracing, either in the budget of DOH or DILG. There was no budget for massive testing, and there was no funds as well for allowances of healthcare workers. And the 2022 proposed budget continued to scrimp on aid. Remember, this was proposed when Bayanihan 1 and Bayanihan 2 already expired. And despite policy recommendations made by the World Bank and the IMF saying that economic aid, especially social protection programs and fiscal stimulus programs, need to be slowly rolled back, not drastically cut. That is what happened to the Philippines. So in the 2022 proposed version of the budget, in the DSWD budget, there was no more funds for massive cash transfer, and there was actually a budget cut for a certain line item that is supposed to help individuals and families and vulnerable groups. So the budget originally in the 2021 GAA was 23.5 billion pesos, and that was cut to 18 billion pesos. The DepEd also had inadequate funds to support distance learnings. We all know what a disaster it was and how that revealed so much digital inequality in the Philippines. Furthermore, in terms of the long-term strategy of the DepEd, it was not designed to address the dropout rates among students, despite claims that the administration as a whole broadly will invest on the youth. When we look at the DOLE budget, which is the budget for labor and employment, we saw that while there were funds for OFWs, for OFW support, there were only marginal changes in labor assistance programs, despite the persistence of unemployment and unemployment. Although there were improvements in the unemployment and underemployment figures compared to the height of the strict lockdowns in 2020, the fact is there are still millions of Filipinos who are unemployed and who are still unemployed, and the numbers are so much higher than pre-pandemic times. For the DTI, as we know, many micro, small, and medium enterprises closed down. Unfortunately, even in the budget of DTI, there were cuts in several key programs, and there was only a 1 billion peso increase for MSME development, despite widespread business closures last year and at the start of the pandemic. We also saw that there were funding allocations for non-urgent expenditure items like the controversial NTFL CAC. Aside from that, there were also other anti-communist insurgency funds in the budget of DILG and specifically the PNP. There was a huge allocation for financial assistance to local government units, which is kind of a discretionary fund on the part of the executive branch. There are huge confidential and intelligence funds under the office of the president. The levels of it remained the same despite the pandemic, and the president's contingent fund continued to be at a level of 13 billion pesos. But how did the 2022 General Appropriations Act turned out, you would expect that there would be improvements considering the many debates that took place during budget legislation last year. And although there were improvements, at least in the Senate version of the budget, after the BICAM, the 2022 national budget looked a lot worse. One positive development, however, is that from being only the top 5 recipient, DOH climbed up to top 3, and then public works and education still at the top 2. This is interesting because in our constitution, it is mandated that education should have the highest allocation in the national budget. However, what ended up with the highest budget allocation in the 2022 enacted version of the budget, this is after the bicameral conference committee, is the Public Works Department, which had around 40 billion pesos budget, higher than the combined budgets of DepEd, the SUCs, SHED, and TESDA. So that opens up constitutional and legal questions, actually. So did Congress violate the Constitution in this case? Because this change took place during budget legislation. And so that's why, in conclusion, the 2022 budget actually looked worse than the 2022 National Expenditure Program. And you already saw the misguided allocations, where there were no funds for the pandemic response. There were even lesser funds for economic aid and stimulus. What we saw in the 2022 GAA are the following. First is, of course, the continued insistence on the brute force approach to infrastructure. The 2022 GAA is definitely an election budget consisting of the highest allocations for pork under the current administration. The unprogrammed appropriations was further bloated, and that means education, health, economic recovery programs do not have guaranteed funding sources. They were basically bumped off from the regular budgets of different agencies and parked into a fund that doesn't have guaranteed financing source. And military and law enforcement funding continues to have a commanding share as well. With respect to the DPWH budget, I already mentioned that it even overtook the combined budgets for basic and tertiary, secondary and tertiary education. But you see here that the DOTR budget, however, was cut by around 30 billion pesos. So the philosophy seemed to be put as many infrastructures as we can into the national budget. Never mind if we do not have allocations for economic aid or fiscal stimulus for businesses that close down. But there is a problem to allocating funds this way. The DPWH, as I said a while ago, and the DOTR have consistently missed their spending targets. And there are no technical studies that show the high multiplier effects of infrastructure in this time of the pandemic. And of course, there's the problematic 2022 election budget, which includes pork. So from only 123, if you recall the earlier slide I showed you, it ended up with a budget of 292 billion pesos. That's basically what happened was pork projects which were accommodated in the regular budgets, meaning the part of the budget that has guaranteed financing source or guaranteed cash cover, was mainly allocated to a 100 billion peso increase into these two line items, which historically have been where pork and patronage driven projects have been lodged. So I mean, can you imagine 292 billion pesos just in 1 year? And this is a lot bigger than the DSWD social amelioration program that was distributed in 2022. That only amounted to 200 billion pesos. And then the bloated and programmed appropriations include 73.8 billion pesos for health. Again, no guaranteed funding. 17.8 billion pesos for education. 25.2 billion pesos for social services. What are some examples of programs in the health programs under the unprogrammed appropriations. That includes the payment for the compensation and benefits of healthcare workers. That includes COVID-19 laboratory commodities. Basically, a lot of the pandemic response programs needed by DOH were part under the unprogrammed appropriations on top of the vaccines being funded via loans. Despite, again, I said the 3.2 trillion peso target revenue collection for the entire 2022. And then the 17.8 billion peso fund there for education includes even the regular budget of the Department of Education for programs and for operations of elementary schools, junior and senior high schools. The 25.2 billion includes some standby funds for social amelioration amounting to only around 5 billion, if I'm not mistaken. Fuel subsidy is also part there, meaning it cannot be released without cash cover, and other livelihood programs that are part of, that used to be part of the regular budgets of DSWD, DA, and other agencies. So again, the unprogrammed appropriations is that part of the national budget that doesn't have guaranteed funding and can only be financed in the event that there are excess revenue collections, new revenue collections, or approved foreign assisted projects. Furthermore, we also saw that apart from the possible constitutional violation where DPWH budgets superseded the budgets for education, the total level of the 2022 budget also increased. And this is a violation of the Constitution because Congress is not supposed to increase the total budget level that is proposed by the executive branch. So aside from the Constitution, it's also reiterated in the 1987 Administrative Code. So the total proposed budget for 2022 is 5 trillion pesos. The enacted version went up by 100 billion pesos. And that is essentially because it tried to accommodate pork projects and move 100 billion pesos worth of projects into the unprogrammed appropriations. So in effect, what we really see is a 2022 national budget that reflects questionable trade-offs, and this took place in the final stretch of budget legislation. Basically, patronage politics really trumped people-centered economic recovery. Economic aid and recovery programs were sacrificed in favor of excessive pork, where there's 292 billion pesos for new pork projects in the DPWH budget, and those are programmed. Those have guaranteed funding as opposed to the total 162.1 billion pesos for education, health, and aid, which do not have guaranteed funding. And so given that situation, that kind of allocation of the fiscal space, we therefore ask, can fiscal discipline really save us? Is it really fiscal discipline that happened there? Is fiscal discipline really reflected in the way the national budget was structured? The IMF and credit rating agencies, as I said a while ago, already kept pointing out that the pandemic has left deep scars in our economy, and fiscal stimulus should be gradually discontinued. Therefore, fiscal policy needs to be designed to buttress the public health system and support households and sectors of the economy to stimulate recovery. But that is not what we see in the national budget. So what really is the problem? Is it the fact that we do not have funds? No, there is money. There is a 5.1 trillion peso national budget, but the prioritization has been pragmatic since the start of the pandemic. Number one, as I said, it's crimped on aid and social protection. Aid, fiscal stimulus were abruptly discontinued with the expiration of the two bayanihan laws, and it failed to design a pandemic responsive and inclusive national budget for 2 consecutive years. Therefore, what should the next administration do? And this is where I'll talk about 3 broad recommendations. The first one is that there is an urgent need for the next administration to rethink and recast the set of budget priorities towards one that will boost health systems and promote inclusive recovery. It is urgent because when the new administration comes in, there is only roughly 1 to 1.5 months until the next national expenditure program is submitted to Congress. So that is the reason why when we think of presidential candidates to vote for, we better consider who has a solid economic recovery plan, because that's very crucial in allocating, in structuring the 2023 upcoming budget. So fiscal policy is still the key to recovery, and there should be a balance between infrastructure development, social protection, and human capital development. We're not saying we don't need infrastructure development. We're not saying transport systems do not need to be modernized. They do. But the budget priorities need to be structured such that it will promote inclusive economic recovery while modernizing our infrastructure. And with respect to the specific priorities, these came out of consultations with the People's Budget Coalition that I lead, our organization, convened together with WeSolve Foundation and the Makati Business Club. What emerged from the consultation with many civil society organizations is that there should be support for Filipino workers. There should be some form of social protection still in the succeeding budgets. Education investment should be sustainable, and it should lead to better learning outcomes. Definitely, there is a need to address the higher dropout rates because of the pandemic. Public transportation needs to be safe, humane, and inclusive. And there is also a need to tweak the infrastructure program such that it will now include digital infrastructure, energy development, DRRM or disaster risk reduction management, climate resilience, and even housing. Again, just yesterday, there was a news article that was published by Business World quoting the IMF, which said governments face difficult choices in this highly uncertain environment. They should focus on the most urgent spending needs and raise revenues to pay for them. Second, there is a need as well to implement structural reforms that would increase the capacity of government agencies to respond to the crisis, as well as the capacity of local government units to use their funds. Dr. Magno already discussed this bit a while ago, so I think I can skip this already. Number 3 is that there's also a need to reestablish open and participatory mechanisms to ensure transparency and accountability in procurement and in the use of COVID-19 funds. Again, Dr. Magno also discussed this already, the need for transparency. But I just want to add that specifically, I think the next administration should establish an online portal that provides comprehensive, timely, and publicly available status reports on fund utilization and project implementation. This used to be a requirement of the Department of Budget and Management for national government agencies, but unfortunately, they have stopped complying to that rule. And furthermore, the next administration should open up spaces that would allow civil society organizations to participate in the budget process as early as the budget preparation phase. That ends my discussion. I hope I did not go over time so much. Thank you, and I will be happy to respond to follow-up questions later.
Thanks, Liza. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this paper before and the issues that you've raised, but it's still so surprising that not enough people are talking about all of these things that you mentioned. But so thank you for leading the charge, so to speak, when it comes to talking about these issues that you see, that you've uncovered in your research when it comes to the budget priorities of government. So thank you so much. I'll now introduce our next speaker. And our next speaker is none other than Dr. Sherwin Ona, who's Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science and Development Studies at De La Salle University. Dr. Ona will be discussing recommendations from his policy paper entitled Digitalization Agenda 2022 Towards a Resilient Philippines Through Digital Transformation and Inclusion. Dr. Ona?
Thank you, Paco. Can you hear me?
Loud
Hello?
and clear. Loud and
Hello,
clear.
thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank StratBase for this kind invitation. It's also always a privilege to be part of your events. Now, allow me to share my slides with you. All right, I hope you can see my slides now. As Paco mentioned, this is my presentation is a summary of the paper or the study that I did for StratBase on crafting a digital transformation agenda for the incoming administration. So I titled my presentation for today as Digital Transformation Agenda Pathways for the Incoming Administration. Now, if I'm going to ask you about having heard of digital transformation, probably your answers will be, yeah, we've heard of it, but we believe that it is, a purely technology centric concept or practice. But on the contrary, if we look at practices around the world and even studies regarding digital transformation, advocates of this strategy posits that it is really about innovation and change and listening to your citizens. If you're government and you're embracing digital transformation, it's about listening to your citizens and knowing their demands. I just want to share an anecdote with you. There was an artillery class, a basic artillery class in the US Army, which featured a very senior lecturer, a senior sergeant lecturing his pupils. These are, students in their early 20s, about how to fire an artillery piece. And the sergeant told them that, guys, before you fire the big guns, you must wait for 8 seconds before you pull that cord to fire. Not 5 seconds, not 10 seconds, it's 8 seconds. Okay. And lo and behold, to his surprise, there was a young enlistee who raised his hand and raised a question to the sergeant and told the sergeant, Sergeant, sir, why do we need 8 seconds? Okay. Just to cover for his not knowing the reason behind it, the sergeant gave that enlistee a dressing down. And after that session, the sergeant, of course, asked his colleagues about the 8-second rule. And apparently, they soon discovered that that 8-second rule was based on an old practice. Actually, it was part of the Napoleonic practice of positioning artillery. They need to dismount the big cannons from the horses and position them, and that would exactly take 8 seconds for them to do it. So what's the moral of the story here? People, young people especially, will now question how we do what we do. Okay? If we are unable to respond to these inquiries, to these demands, chances are we'll be left with nothing. Okay? Now, going into that idea of being able to see what's coming in the horizon, studies abound about this. You can find studies by the Asian Development Bank, World Bank, the World Economic Forum that points to this emerging set of practices or trends. And of course, COVID-19 served as a watershed moment for digital transformation to really blossom. And during the pandemic, of course, we have seen an increase in consumers using their mobile devices, especially to transact. WEF is projecting that by 2024, there will be 20% increase in demand for telemedicine. Um, of course, there is a bit of a challenge here. Many of you might have heard of the term digital divide. There still exists such reason why people cannot partake in the benefits of digital transformation. Studies point to 45% of households still do not have access to the internet worldwide. And in least developed countries, 19% of households have access to the internet. Now, in Asia, of course, they're seeing much growth in terms of digital transformation, simply because a large segment of the population have access to the internet and is, digital savvy and is part of social media. And they're underscoring the fact that there are many startups emerging from ASEAN nations. So that's why they termed it as a digital hotspot or a hotspot for digital development. Also, a study by the OECD points to the growth potential of what do you call this? E-logistics, integrated e-commerce that can empower small and medium scale enterprises. And we will see this growing to 2025. Are these writings on the wall? Are we ready for this? Now, if you look at the practices of digital transformation, as I've said earlier, the misconception is it is purely a technology-centric practice. Again, on the contrary, if you look at cases and experiences of various countries, the most important aspect of digital transformation is the ability of an organization or even a state to present a coherent vision. When we are embracing digital transformation, what do we want to be? How do we get there? The strategy and the right culture that we can adopt. Of course, there's always a technology competency, access to technology and having the right resources, particularly human resources, to support your digital transformation efforts. Digital transformation is also, I mentioned earlier about change. Also, part of that is questioning existing models. In the private sector, they call it business models. But of course, in the public sector, we try to term it as governance, no? Governance model. Can we give our citizens, this experience, this new experience? How do we express our value to them? No? And of course, if you look at the cases of digital transformation in various countries, many of them are powered by SMEs and startups. Now, if you, again, examine the role of the state, I mentioned the importance of creating a vision. No? And aside from having that vision, it is usually expressed through national policies, strategies, and for low income and middle income countries, digital transformation is often attached to the idea of national development. Okay. Again, digital transformation is always citizen-centric. It is sensitive to what the demands of citizens are. And the question that always pervades in the discussion of digital transformation, especially in the public sector, is how do we get our citizens to be part of digital transformation initiatives? On the other hand, there is also the security implication. No? If we're going into a purely digital, a digital by default model, how do we protect our infrastructure? How do we protect information? How do we protect data? Eventually, how do we protect our citizens? We have often seen nations leading the charge with regard to digital transformation. We can look at, for instance, the example of Australia, of course, the European Union, of Japan, of Israel, on how they did their digital transformation initiatives. Digital transformation initiatives is not a government alone show. There is always that, that crucial partnership with the private sector. All right? So, hindi lang to pang gobyerno, no? Very crucial ang role ng private sector dito, especially the startups, no? The cases that I reviewed, no? Small companies, no? Small startups, no? Often lead the charge digital transformation. And of course, we must underscore emerging technologies. Having a website, having mobile applications, having to transfer your cash via your mobile phones. These are not digital transformation technologies, no? Yeah, they're part of digital technologies, but we are now looking at disruptive technologies, that can change the way we do our business, the way we live our lives, the way we transact with our citizens. And literature will tell us that, artificial intelligence is leading the way for this. People's online transactions are being culled for data analytics purposes. Of course, the presence of cloud services is another facet of this emerging trend. Now, just to summarize, when you say if government is going to go digital, of course, aside from tapping in on the power of digital technologies and cutting edge technologies in particular, like AI, IoT, etc., cloud services, etc., we must now learn how to value data and information. That's why in my paper, I specifically underscored the value of having a data governance regime. How do we manage data? How do we protect it? Who owns it? Do we design it using the principle of privacy by design? Okay. And lastly, how do we now push innovation to its fullest? Okay. How do we now bring people in? Aside from improving our services, how do we increase the trust of people in government? Very important po yan. No? Using that frame of improving trust, no? Yung anti-corruption, transparency, openness. How can digital transformation address this? Siguro the question now that you're entertaining in your minds is that, is our government capable of this? Is government capable of this? Okay. Government is usually depicted as a leviathan, di ba? It's a big organization that is resource hungry and not so efficient. Okay. But is government capable of this? Well, in terms of the Philippines, as I've argued in my many presentations, DX, digital transformation, is an uphill climb for us. As the World Bank correctly notes, that, in terms of broadband access, it's still an uphill battle for us. 60% of Filipino households lack internet access. All right. The World Bank described the Philippines as an analog economy because of our low broadband penetration. We're still at a 3G, 4G download speed as compared to our ASEAN neighbors, which has significantly improved their download speed. We are one of the higher costing internet broadband countries, having almost $7 per month. Okay. And in terms of cybersecurity, of course, during the pandemic, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas estimates that 500 million pesos were lost because of cyber crimes. Okay, so there's a huge challenge for the country. Now, di ba? Puro Puro concepts and negative perception, di ba? But can countries really do it, no? Well, of course, I have an example here, the example of Estonia, which is a country that gained independence in 1991 and was considered during the time as one of the impoverished countries in Europe. But because of the internet and their vision to really be a digital society in 2 decades, they were able to do this. Now, if you go to Estonia, 90% of their government services are online. In fact, if you insist to go to a physical government office, they will add, a certain percentage to your transaction cost. You have to pay more if you want to go to a brick and mortar government office. All right. And they have a platform that does this, no? Online government platform called the X Road, which uses a unique ID card. No? Each citizen has an ID card that allows him or her to transact with government. Okay. By the year 2000, it's the only country, I guess, up to now who declared internet access as a basic human right enshrined in their constitution. It is a country that has the highest proportion of tech unicorns, innovators, versus their population. By 2001, they've already perfected their online taxes. They started online voting. Imagine online voting in 2005, although they perfected this somewhere 2013. All right. And they adopted digital citizen ID by 2002. Okay. So that early, they were thinking of how to leverage the power of the internet and, of course, digital technologies. Now, for the digital transformation agenda that I propose in my study, I believe that incoming Filipino leaders should adopt basic principles when they go into digital transformation. All right. Dr. Magno mentioned about interoperability, the need to address corruption mentioned by Professor Manhit. Yeah, right. Those are all valid issues. And in fact, if you are going into this and you are a leader, an incoming leader, you must now invest in the idea of digital transformation in government. No? And what does that look like? It's about service interoperability. You have integrated government services. Unlike now that most of our services are what we call siloed. Okay, in order for you to get a passport, you will visit like how many government offices? No, 10, 15 government offices in order for you to have a passport. All right. Why not have a single entry point for this? No, an integrated access point for government services. We need to curate data. We need to have standards for data management, on how to secure data, on how to guarantee privacy. Right? We need to continue our open government. Okay. This is our only tool, no, against corruption. No? At least digital tool. No? We need to embrace again the idea of openness, transparency, and more participation. Okay. So these leaders should believe in this, no, in order to adopt digital transformation. Okay. Another idea that our incoming leaders should adopt is that the digital transformation is a crucial tool for inclusion. Okay, we have heard the previous speaker mention about problems in education. Okay, in other marginalized sectors, MSMEs in particular, and of course, education sector. We know for a fact that in my study, I cited an ADB study which said that only 20% of public school students were able to avail of online distant learning. What happened to the 80? Di ba? Nawala na sila. No? So these technologies should be used really to address the concerns of marginalized groups, especially with the pandemic still here. No? This should be a tool to address these inequalities. And lastly, we need to protect our infrastructure. Okay, we cannot just adopt all of these things without being conscious of how to protect privacy, protect citizens in particular, and of course, our digital infrastructure in general. In my study, I alluded to three areas. If our incoming leaders are to prioritize three areas, my suggestion is to look at public health. Well, of course, because we're still in a pandemic and that the pandemic surfaced a lot of disparities, allegations of corruption, and mere incompetence. Okay. In my paper, I argue that, of course, this can be addressed by digital transformation, partly, of course. We have fragmented policies and resources. For instance, up to now, we do not have a singular contact tracing application. Ano? Yung stay safe is, I don't know, it's functioning. We're unable to map COVID cases, no? Having a digital map of COVID cases. For MSMEs, of course, prolonged closures affected our MSMEs. And, you know, this resulted to overdependence on government. Ergo, the ayuda system, di ba? But, you know, we have also seen some positive results. No? For instance, yung shift to online transactions. But we need to invest more on linking supply chains, demands, and market. Okay, and we are able, digital transformation through artificial intelligence is capable of anticipating customer demands. And of course, in education, address the huge disparity created by the pandemic. And of course, in some instances, these are access issues and even power issues as well. No? Electric power, walang kuryente. Okay, this should be addressed as part of a digital transformation priorities. Okay, on the plus side, we have, you know, many Filipinos into social media, into online stuff. Okay, the fintech sector is showing some vibrancy. Positive side on us. We enjoy very good ratings in terms of e-participation in open government. We should continue that, and we should capitalize on the digital savviness of Filipinos. This is another plus side. We have laws that we can use. We have the ease of doing business, as previous speakers mentioned. We have the National ID Act. The purpose of this really is to use the ID as your main passport for seamless government services, online services. Okay, so we need to really harness that. We have existing plans, but we're good at making plans, but we really have, you know, tremendous challenge when it comes to implementation. We're undergoing continuous development in terms of our human resources, and we have existing projects and resources that we can tap for digital transformation. On the policy end, these are the things that I'm proposing, of course, to continue linking digital transformation to the national development plans, the medium-term development plan of the incoming administration. It's very crucial, and a crucial ingredient in bureaucratic reform, in achieving our openness, transparency, participation, and efficiency of services goals. Of course, I cited National ID, Data Privacy Act. Okay, I would like to again highlight that although we have these laws, and these laws are really great, most of these laws are fragmented. No? They don't have really an idea of integrating government services or embracing the idea of digital transformation. So we need really to synergize all of these laws. Okay, and of course, underscore the role of the private sector and civil society in all of these endeavors. We are at a crossroads, and with that, these are my recommendations. We have a national digital strategy, but for some reason, it was pulled out from the DICT website. And that National Digital Transformation Plan is just like a 2019 plan. So it's a very young plan, a new plan. Now, but if the incoming administration will embrace digital transformation as a way forward, it should have a whole of society philosophy. It should, in my opinion, embrace the idea of digital by default, privacy by design, and good governance principles. I also reiterate the need for a digital government law, a cyber defense policy for a proactive cyber defense posturing. There are bills on health security. That health security bill, I believe, should have a DX component. Okay, very crucial in the DX equation is the idea of leadership. No? So, in the many cases that I reviewed, the role of the president of the prime minister is very important. Okay, so my suggestion is to have an executive level task force or a digital transformation agency, as what UK and Australia did. The US also has a cyber infrastructure and security agency, so that can be, a model that we can look at. Try to develop packages for DX, incentive packages for the private sector, and continue to develop communities of practice. With that, I end my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Ona. That was very interesting. I'm a fan of your research always on Industry 4.0 and the role of technology in the different aspects of society, including combating corruption and governance issues. So again, thank you, Dr. Ona, Chairperson of the Department of Political Science at LaSalle and Fellow of Stratbase ADRi Institute. Next up, we'll be hearing from Dr. Rizal Buendia. Dr. Buendia is the Philippine country expert at the Global VDEM Institute at the University of Gothenburg. He's also a non-resident fellow of the Stratbase Institute. Dr. Buendia will be talking about his policy paper entitled Lessons and Prospects in the Philippine Political Governance, Cutting Across Regimes from Marcos to Duterte. So his paper gives a more, looks back at previous administrations and tries to extract lessons on political governance. Dr. Buendia.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to apologize for not being able to virtually attend this very important webinar due to a previous commitment I have to fulfill. I'm sorry if this presentation will be made via video. And second, I wish to thank Professor Dindo Manhit, President of the Stratbase ADR Institute and a friend and colleague of mine at the LSU, for inviting me to write a paper on governance and make this presentation. The paper is a concise assessment and snapshot of Philippine governance under 7 presidents covering more than 5 decades. I do hope that the limitation of space and time does not render injustice engaging the state of political governance and democracy in the country. The presentation shall have this outline. Starting with the question of the significance of governance, it will be followed by the state of key governance areas, among others, transparency and accountability, electoral politics, political party system, political participation, and populist politics. And finally, a proposal on what needs to be done. I argue that 57 years, inclusive of 36 years of regime of personalistic governance, has largely contributed to the growing corrosion of political institutions. The pathologies of the country's electoral system have weakened the legitimacy of government. The feeble party system, turncoatism, patronage politics, elitism, violence, and other corrupt practices of some government officials have emasculated the processes and institutions of democracy. Towards the end, I propose the institutionalization of a multi-party system which employs the use of proportional representation, and second, the adoption of holistic governance which minimizes, if not avoids, fragmented governance due to the functional divisions of the bureaucracy. Governance in international development literature is seen as a move away from the usual government approach to processes and governing. As defined by the World Bank, governance is the manner in which power is exercised in the management of a country's economic, financial, technical, and social resources for development. Inasmuch as governance appropriates power, authority, and access, and apportions political commodities among those who govern and those who are governed, it essentially catalyzes socioeconomic and political transformation and facilitates the creation of a peaceful, prosperous, just, and humane society through key actors of governance. These are the government, civil society, private sector, and media. The figure graphically depicts the interlocking relationships between and among governance actors. There are no lucid boundaries between these players as the sectors are permeable. They occupy the social and economic landscape within the context of the traditions, values, and history that characterize society. Transparency and accountability, considered by the UN as part of a set of principles of good governance, are the fundamental elements of abolishing corruption in either local or national government. Tackling corruption include adequate and credible flow of information, strong civil society, effective and transparent financial management systems, and procurement regulations whose process are fair and open. It is unfortunate that the country has poor performance in terms of checking corruption, as shown by the following indicators: World Bank's Control of Corruption Indicator, Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, and Political and Economic Research Consultancy. Over 2 decades, from 1996 to 2019, under the presidencies of Ramos, Estrada, Arroyo, Aquino III, and Duterte, World Bank indicators show that corruption has not been abated. The slide displays the estimated governance scores ascribed to the Philippines. The worldwide governance indicators assesses the country's governance performance ranging from negative 2.5 to positive 2.5 on corruption control. The country has consistently obtained negative scores. Electoral politics has deep historical roots, commencing under direct US colonial rule. The imposition of the system of voting in predominantly feudal and agrarian society has been enmeshed in elections. Hence, the concoction of neo-feudal traditions and liberal practices has portrayed Philippine electoral politics as patron-client and symbiotic relationships, personality-based rather than on issues and programs of government, geographically and ethno-linguistically determined, and clan-based. These have contributed to the dysfunctions of Philippine democracy and electoral system. A party system is concerned with the type of government by political parties in a democratic country, or how political power is obtained. The system illustrates and classifies different political positions of parties in relation to one another. Political parties are easily one of the most visible institutions in a democracy. For most ordinary citizens, democracy is equal to political parties. But what is a political party? Edmund Burke defines it as a body of men united for promoting by their endeavors the national interest upon some particular principle in which they all agreed. While Robert Gilchrist describes it as an organized group of citizens who prefer to share the same political views and who are acting as a political unit try to control the government. One of the fundamental characteristics of Philippine political party system is the absence of any discernible ideological or philosophical differences between political parties. This made party switching or turncoatism a common feature of Philippine politics. What is important to the life of Philippine political parties is the accession or defection of village leaders or barangay chairpersons, mayors, governors, congresspeople, and senators toward the party with the spoils. After elections, politicians feel no obligation to their party. Loyal of political butterflies is justified by the dictates of patriotism. On political participation, the paper focuses on non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, engagement in governance, party list system, and third on people's initiative. The elite-based political parties and traditional politicians debilitated the perspective of a strong participation of civil society organization in governance. Post-Marcos political regimes fortified the alliances between dynastic political clans and some NGOs and CSOs. The patronage character of Philippine politics has undermined government CSO collaboration in governance. The Philippines has no more than 20% of the total number of party list representatives in the House of Representatives and a maximum of 3 seats per party list party. This low threshold and restriction in representation simply lead to small parties with narrow interests. Some party list groups are either highly influenced or controlled by the elite and traditional politicians as well as political clans. 2 attempts were made to amend the 1987 Constitution using People's Initiative. The one was made in 1997 under the Fidel Ramos when he tried to shift the presidential system of government to parliamentary and lift the term limits of elected officials, including himself. The second was in 2006 under Gloria Arroyo's administration when he bid to replace the presidential unitary form to a parliamentary federal. Both initiatives were rejected by the Supreme Court for their failure to comply with the requirements of the Constitution and inability of the proponents to show the people the full text of the proposed amendments before having them to sign the petition. People's Initiative was likewise used to introduce statutes yet ended up unsuccessfully. One was aimed to abolish congressional and presidential pork barrel as a consequence of the 10 billion scam on the misappropriation of PDAP in 2013. The scam involved 3 presidents, Estrada, Arroyo, and Aquino III. And 2, the attempt to secure a franchise when ABS-CBN Broadcasting Network was denied by the House of Representatives in its application for a 25-year franchise. Ergo, People's Initiative as a form of enhancing people's participation has been frail in terms of making meaningful political change and reforms. The continuing failure of governance and unrelenting corruption, sustained elitism in the political system, problem of peace and order, poverty, injustice, and concentration of power in the central government for more than 3 decades after the fall of Marcos regime have led to the rise of populism. Although populist leaders are very much part of the economic and political elite, they are able to project themselves as anti-elite and adept in associating themselves with the hopes and desires of the poor. In Webb and Curato's study, they conclude that the lack of outrage in Duterte's leadership is a response to the people's frustration with liberal democracy, which was unable to resolve unspeakable miseries. Populism has restricted rather than expanded democratic rule. It is not only an indicator of the breakdown of democracy, but has potential to prevent the emergence of democratic conventions. Solving multifaceted and multidimensional problems that cut across socioeconomic, political, and boundaries require new approaches and institutionalization of a principle and ideologically based multi-party system and holistic governance. In a multi-party system, parties develop their potential and capacity to gain power and control of government or coalesce with other parties with similar or related program of government or ideologies. It reinforces the use of proportional representation. This builds up the distribution of seats that reflect the range of population's views on policy reforms and national visions. And a multi-party system equally prevents the leadership of a single party from controlling the legislature without a challenge. The nature and goal of holistic governance is the creation of a new paradigm in which directly appeals to the needs of the public. Online governance will be the main driver for holistic governance. Through this approach, integration problems of administrative activities can be solved professionally and administratively rather than politically. Holistic governance promotes an integrated government organization. The integration requires the changing of values structure in government operation. This necessitates the integration of the values of integrity, accountability, service, equity, innovation, teamwork, excellence, honesty, commitment, quality, openness, communication, trust, effectiveness, leadership, and ideas. In the final analysis, the political leadership will play the most important role in achieving the momentum that the holistic governance ideals demand. In like manner, the extent of political leaders and institutions and legitimacy is limited by people's support. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bindia. So that was Dr. Bindia sharing his some insights from his paper, Lessons and Prospects in Philippine Political Governance, Cutting Across Regimes from Marcos to Duterte. So that actually concludes the panel discussion for this morning. And we have now a few minutes for our open forum. So if I could ask the speakers that we have here, Dr. Ona and Zaiza, to join the open forum. I think it's nice actually that we have the two of you here. I think it'll make for a very engaging discussion. And I'd love to hear some of your feedback or your answers to some of the questions that have been posed to us through the Q&A function of Zoom, through chat and through email. Again, please, I want to open the Q&A section up to our participants. Please do feel free to send us your questions and we'll try to ask our speakers. So first up, I'm pulling from, let me pull up my phone. I'm pulling from one of the questions asked in Zoom. And the question we have here is, can we conclude that the problems persistently hampering the government to lift up its quality are deeply institutionalized? Do these institutionalized government problems have anything to do with the power constellations between the executive and the legislatives, as well as the authority constellations amongst government departments and constitutional commissions? Any input on that, Dr. Ona, Zaiza?
Si Saisa muna. Nandiyan ba si Saisa?
That is a good question in itself. Ay, nawala.
Nawala siya. All right.
Nawala.
I can answer that using my topic, yung
Sure,
digital
please.
transformation. When you say institutionalized persistent
It's-
problems, I'm looking at it through the lens of digital transformation. Of course, as I've mentioned in my presentation, we've been doing digital government for the past 2 decades or more. And we have little to show. We have little to show when it comes to the use of digital technologies in government. In my opinion, this can be traced, of course, to the lack of a clear vision of what digital technologies can do in government, and what is the role of government? The role of government that is really I think the main issue here. Now, of course, we can talk about the lack of policies, the lack of resources, which I disagree. We don't lack resources. There's actually this back in 2005, then President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, because of her belief in the power of e-government, allotted 2 billion and designated this as e-government fund. But unfortunately, after a year, the agencies were not able to use this fund. And by 2006, Congress slashed it into half. The agencies were given 1 billion as e-government fund. And again, the agencies were forced to return the fund, simply because they were not able to use it. So I think there is this challenge of looking at it in terms of strategy. How are we really looking at, if we were going to use digital transformation, how do we really envision digital transformation in government? Okay. And what are the benefits can this initiative or this concept bring to us and give us? And how can this change the landscape of governance? Siguro yun yung mga essential questions that we can ask. Is there a struggle between the executive and the legislative? We mentioned the need for more laws. No? Congress will be happy to enact all of these laws, no? Because these are, pump priming laws, so to speak. No? However, it's aside from laws, no, it's actually how we implement the existing laws. I mentioned that we have a National ID Act. Okay, we have an Ease of Doing Business Act. These are laws that we can use to really push for digital transformation. But in this administration, it's really leaves little to be desired, so to speak. We have the laws, but the push is not there. So we are hoping that the incoming administration can really embrace digital transformation. We have no choice. Our neighbors are doing it already. Okay? Sabi ko nga sa isang forum, kulela tayo if we will not do this. No? Maiwanan tayo sa kangkungan. No? Magiging laggard na naman tayo. So, really, we have to take this opportunity and really use it to our benefit. I think that's it, Paco. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Zaiza, are you back with us?
I'm the Lone Ranger for this session.
Okay.
No?
Sige, sige. Dr. Ana, I have another question for you, which I think is an interesting one. So in your presentation, you talk about, of course, all of the benefits of digital transformation. Clearly, we've seen it naman with the growth of e-commerce and fintech here in the Philippines. So how it
Is Saisa
can
there?
be, yeah, I think she's.
Ayan na, Saisa.
Hi, Saisa.
Sorry, my connection dropped. I had to log in to mobile phone.
Okay, I'm glad that you were able to come back and reconnect. So, Dr. Ona, it's okay. I go back to Zaiza.
Yeah, sure. Please,
Okay.
please. Please.
Or maybe I should just ask this to both of you, because Zaiza, I was just starting a question for Dr. Ona, and you both mentioned the importance or the value of digital tools, digital transformation, or maybe participation through websites for more transparency as ways to combat to improve governance here in the Philippines. And I wanted to get your feedback and your inputs on, okay, it's recognized that there are benefits, but as we've seen as we approach the election, there are also some downsides: cybersecurity, the disinformation, issues and challenges that we're facing as the role of technology grows in society. How do you see us balancing these things, and how can we make it more of a benefit for us than it is a challenge? The use of technology in fighting governance. Zaiza, maybe you want to.
I think as Dr. Ona already mentioned, that there is a need to come up with a broader framework by which government will define what really should be the policies, and of course the executive branch, particularly the incoming administration, will have to work with Congress in order to do that. But for me, coming from civil society and also having worked inside government, I think when it comes to ensuring that technology and digital infrastructure in government benefits us citizens, it's important to have a dynamic civil society as well, and to continue participating despite the presence of perhaps innovations in technology. I think as far as civil society is concerned, and ensuring transparency and accountability is concerned, it is critical in terms of maintaining the integrity of the data that the government publishes. But of course, it cannot work on its own. I mean, for me, technology cannot work on its own without civil society actually participating as well in the processes that it is supposed to facilitate, that it is supposed to improve and make more efficient.
Thanks, Liza. Dr. Ona.
Thank you, Paco. You know, I've always said, no, digital technologies are two-bladed instruments or two-edged. It can cut you both ways. No, it can give you the benefits that you envision, but it can also hurt you. And we have seen this in particular during the pandemic. No, of course, we were unable to really maximize digital technologies. However, we have seen, for instance, the spread of fake news, misinformation, which resulted to rumors and undesired actions from our citizens. Diba? They flock into vaccination sites, fearing that government will lock them down without without vaccination certificates. So I believe that when my thing here is we need to go back to basics when we go into digital transformation. And mind you, this is not a simple investment. No, this will cost us a lot. But when we go into it, the principles should be there. Okay, we should believe in something. We are not doing digital transformation because services will be faster. No, we are doing this because we believe that, for instance, engaging citizens will enable government to be more responsive. Okay, we believe that if we create, open spaces, new things will flourish. We can engage more. We can stamp corruption out. Okay, there will be services will be more efficient, will be more transparent. Okay, given na yan eh, no? But aside from that, no, we need to really think of our way forward. No, we have talked about good governance and anti-corruption for so long. Yes, there are valid issues, but we also need to create this vision, this long-term vision of what we want to be. And if we're going to invest in digital transformation in any reform endeavor for that matter, no, we should know where we're going. No, it's not only the next 6 years. No, this is an investment that we will do strategically, long term. Ito pa. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Ona. Thanks, Liza. Okay, so I'm actually going to backtrack a bit to the first question that I had asked Dr. Ona earlier, and it was from Ziza. It was a question from the audience about institutionalized issues when it comes to governance and governance problems being institutionalized. And I agree, right? There is this, even throughout the discussion, throughout the papers, we forward a lot of recommendations, policy recommendations for the next administration. But at the same time, I can't help but feel that it's almost like a moving target, especially when given your presentations, Isa, right? Where it's a moving target, where there's some, what I think Dr. Magno described as democratic backsliding, where we're actually moving backwards. So the target is moving, and it's moving farther away from us, right? What do you think? How do we address this? Obviously, we have recommendations for the next administration, but are there any other things that you think we can do as Seguro, as civil society, or maybe as we also have a lot of students here participating? What can we do to sort of combat this democratic backsliding that we're seeing?
Yeah, for us in civil society, at least I lead and the co-conveners of the coalition that we formed, one critical aspect of democratic participation that we would really like to strengthen here in the Philippines is specifically in terms of the allocation of resources. Therefore, to us, a core, a centerpiece of of democratic participation is participation in the budget process. This is because civil society in the Philippines has had a long history of, policy advocacy, monitoring of outcomes and things like that. But it has generally been weak in terms of participating in budget processes at both the national and the local levels. And I think this is a really potent process that civil society needs to get into. For one, here in the Philippines, many civil society organizations are clear as to what the policy and perhaps the political agenda should be. But like I always say, policies, advocacies can actually be implemented by government only if there are concomitant funding sources for them. And that's why it's important to buttress that policy advocacy with a very specific kind of technical advocacy when it comes to budget lobbying. I think that is a very powerful way by which we can first not only demand transparency and accountability, but push for a more inclusive democratic governance agenda.
Thanks, Isa. Dr. Ana, do you want to weigh in on that in any way, on what we can do as individuals to increase transparency and accountability?
I think as I have as I have mentioned, again, using my topic, we need to create spaces. We need to create spaces. How these things would transpire. Of course, digitally we can, through digital transformation, especially if government embraces this. These spaces can be created. Spaces can be created. However, you again, as I've mentioned, we do not do this because it's convenient for us. As I've mentioned, it's an investment and it should be driven by certain principles. If we need inclusivity, okay, to address marginalization, then our spaces, in this case, our digital spaces, should be designed for it. And that's how I see it, using my DX lens.
Thanks, Dr. Ana. Okay, so I'm kind of aware of the time, and we are kind of over. So maybe we could close this up with one. Generally, I would say it's a broad question, but please feel free, Dr. Ana and Zaiza, to take it any way that you want. So we have a question here. Okay, I'm trying to phrase it properly. Okay, given the current candidates programs and platforms, what do you think, what would you say should be their top priority when whoever wins, regardless of who wins, what should their top priority be in terms of reforms, in particular relating to the research of the papers that you did? Just one top reform. What would that be? Dr. Ana?
You mean coming in from my study, right?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, okay. So the DX perspective. So my suggestion in my paper is that to prioritize 3 sectors. So public health, MSMEs, and education. I think in the first 100 days, this should be very clear. If the incoming administration will adopt a digital transformation strategy, those 3 areas should be mentioned as priority areas because of course, the adverse impact of the pandemic. And of course, the profound effect or effects of closing all of these sectors because of the pandemic. So if we're going to invest in digital transformation, then these 3 sectors can really push those investments forward, and we'll have benefits that we can immediately reap.
Thanks, Dr. Ana. Zaiza, over to you.
Thanks, Paco. Yes. So coming from the first paper that we wrote and the second paper that we wrote, I would say it's really there's an urgent need to tweak fiscal policy for two reasons. One is because of the effect of the pandemic on the public health system, and second, as we've all been mentioning here, the socio-economic impact of the pandemic, and that's compounded right now by the global oil price hikes. So there's really a need to tweak fiscal policy the moment the new administration takes office. What would that entail? It has to go beyond simply managing the deficit and trying to bring down the debt in terms of the financial side of public financial management. It has to look at the expenditure side of public financial management, such that those three priority areas, which Dr. Ona mentioned and which I fully agree on, these are also the sectors mentioned in our paper. There's a need to address the pandemic by strengthening our public health systems. There's a need to provide adequate stimulus for MSMEs that close down. And really, the MSMEs are the backbone of our economy. 99% of the Philippine economy is comprises MSMEs, and that's why, because of the closures, many Filipinos lost jobs. And number three is education, which, as I kept saying in my presentation, needs to address not just the digital divide or the need for hybrid learning systems, but ultimately to address the dropout rates that will impact us in the future. Because how is our economy going to be competitive if we do not invest sufficiently on education, and not just in terms of trying to cope with the great shifts in our learning systems, but more importantly, in terms of the learning outcomes in basic education. So there, yeah, fiscal policy, and tweak it not only on the finance side, meaning you just manage the revenues and try to bring down the debt, but really manage the expenditure side, because that was what was problematic all these years, given the misguided budget priorities.
Thanks, Liza. So yes, with that, I'd like to close the open forum. I really wish that we had more time. I know that we only have 2 of the 4 speakers who stayed with us all the way into the open forum, but still it feels like there wasn't enough time to ask all the questions that we wanted. So again, I'd like to thank first and foremost Professor Manhit for organizing this event, impactful governance reforms for the next administration. I'd like to thank our speakers, beginning with Dr. Magno, who talked about governance, comprehensively presented his paper and his findings on governance agenda for development. For Ms. Zaida Suzara, for her presenting her paper on rethinking public spending priorities towards an inclusive recovery. Dr. Ona for his digitalization agenda 2022, and of course Dr. Buendia, who joined us all the way from half around the world to share his insights on lessons and prospects in the Philippine political governance, cutting across regimes. So with that, again, I'd like to thank all of our participants as well for joining us this morning. And I'd like to reiterate that all of these papers, you'll be able to read more about them once the Institute launches its Beyond the Crisis, a strategic agenda for the next president. It'll be published as a hardbound book, and it will be released online as well. You can already actually find some of the papers on our website and through social media. So again, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to all of our participants. This event will be available for a recording of this event will be available for watching after on our social media channels. So again, thank you very much, Dr. Ona, Zaiza, Professor Munit.
Thank you.
It's been great having you. And until next time.
Thank you, Paco.
Until next time. Thank you so
Saisa,
much.
great to meet you, Saisa.
Thank you. you, Dr. Ona. Thank you, Professor. Bye, Paco.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye. Maybe next time face to face. That would be nice.
Sure,
Okay.
sure. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.